Welcome back, and we are on the Yoga Sutras, Section 1, Sutra 5. And again, these are the 5 primary books that we are using. There's other supplementary material. So as we come to Sutra 5, we're going to discover that this sutra is the introduction. And then in Sutras 6 through 11, we are receiving a training in how to start to uncover the vrittis that cover up the self, which is the soul, and then eventually the triad in the Alice Bailey model, where we get to Atma. And we're going to begin with 2 general categories here in this sutra, and then 5 subcategories. So let's look at the Sanskrit. And Vrittayaha Panchatiyaha Klishta Klishtaha, or the modifications of the 5-fold painful, painless are. Or, to say it differently, there are 5 kinds of mental modifications which are either painful or painless. And that is the first interpretation by Swami Satchidananda. As you know, in the different videos that we've done so far, there are different ways to kind of translate this, but in general, Swami Satchidananda's translation is the most common. So let's look at what our authors have to say about this. And we're going to start with Swami Satchidananda. And if it's not in quotes, I am paraphrasing what he says here. And what I really like about his interpretation of the sutra is he says it is better to call painful vrittis selfish and non-painful vrittis selfless, because selfish actions, even if pleasurable, can lead to pain, whereas selfless actions, even if they involve pain, can lead to pleasure. And again, that's me paraphrasing him, but I have a quote here as he gives an example. Quote, "For example, to love something or somebody is pleasurable, but many of you have experienced how the very same love brought you a lot of unhappiness, pain, hatred, jealousy, and so on. Why? Because that love was not just a pure love, but was based on some expectation in return. There was selfishness in it. The expectation may be anything, a little financial comfort, some publicity, or a little physical pleasure. With this expectation, love seldom lasts long. So love, though it appears to be a painless thought, ultimately ends in pain if it is based on selfishness." And when we look at the Bailey model again in this video a little later, we will be reminded that whenever we're a coordinated personality or even an integrated personality who is not yet soul infused or has lifted into the triad, the true self, we are going to have vrittis that fall into the category of selfish. And therefore, even if they appear to be non-painful, they are actually painful vrittis here. That's a very important distinction that Swami Satchidananda has helped us to see. Now we're going to look at a little bit from Taimni, and this again is a paraphrase, that there is always potential pleasure in pain, and pain can eventually lead to pleasure. That's a paraphrase from Taimni. Now, I'm going to go back to what Swami Satchidananda has to say, because that's true until we get to the soul-infused personality and especially to the triad. So keep Swami Satchidananda's interpretation in mind as we go along here. So looking at what Iyengar has to say, he emphasizes that vrittis may be cognizable or non-cognizable, or we may be able to know what they are and see them and be able to remove them right away. That was painful, that was selfish, or they're non-cognizable. We may not see them. They're unconscious to us, and we have to become aware of them and dig them out, so to speak. And Iyengar brings in the notion that we are talking about klista, painful, and aklista, non-painful. And one way we get to aklista, non-painful, or selfless, to go back to Swami Satchidananda, is to develop our discrimination. This is so important, this viveka. We have Swami Vivekananda in there, and that means that he had a lot of discrimination, which led him to the Ananda, the bliss here. Now let's look at some of what Taimni has to say. Vrittis can also be neutral, such as when we just notice something and no thoughts get attached to it. So we walk by a tree and we just notice a tree. We don't have any kind of emotional or mental connection to it. We're just simply noticing and observing and then letting it go right away. And he says too that when vrittis are neutral, whether pleasurable or painful, we simply maintain our equanimity with them. And finally, he says both painful and non-painful can bind us to the illusion of life. What does he mean by that? That means that we are attached to the world of the five senses. And again, we're trying to become more and more detached from that as we move upwards to the true self. So now we're going to look at what Alice Bailey had to say in her book, Light of the Soul. Remember, this is written by Bailey and not her Tibetan, as she called him. And it was written 100 years ago, so they all used the male pronoun. Don't let that trip you up. She says, he must not lose sight of the fact that we are dealing with the lower psychic nature, which is the term occultly applied to the lower mind processes as well as to the astral or emotional reactions. All activity in the lower nature is the result of kama-manas, or of mind tinged with feeling, or the desire will of the lower man. The goal of the Raja Yoga system is that these impulses should be replaced by the considered, intelligent action of the soul or spiritual man whose nature is love, whose acts are wise, occultly understood, and whose motive is group development. All right, so let's use Bailey's chart to try and explain some of this for you here. And if you're familiar with these charts already in other videos, bear with me. There might be some new information here for you, and if not, the repetition I'm sure would do you good anyway. So let's go through this. First of all, we have to understand that there are 7 different levels: physical, emotional, mental, intuitional or Buddhic, spiritual or Atmic, and these 2 higher levels are not human, monadic and divine, so I'm not going to go into those. We're just going to stick with where humans evolve, and that's up to the Atmic plane, which you see over here in the Yoga and Vedanta system. We go all the way up to Atma, 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 Atma here. That's my traditional models of Yoga and Vedanta. You see that the goal is to reach the Atmic plane here, here, and here. But most of humanity in its evolution is done with physical coordination of their bodies, and most humans can learn how to get along and get their basic needs met. A lot of them still can't, which is why Bailey says that most humans are still a mixture of what she calls group 3. They're still struggling to get some of their basic needs met. And that's why they're still kind of right in here. So most of humanity is in this range here, which is kind of shocking to see how far away they are from the Atmic plane, the goal that we're trying to get to. They are full of desire mind, which she talked about in her quote. They're full of emotions. They're driven by the highs and lows of their emotions and their desires for things in the world of the 5 senses: more money, security, sex, pleasure, and power. That's what they want. Though most human beings don't have power, that's why they're in here. Those that have a lot of power as coordinated personalities, finally, it says coordinated personality when completed, that means you get up here, tend to be those that have all the money, sex, pleasure, and power you could ever want in massive excess. Billionaires, now we're reaching what could be a trillionaire. Notice how they're still not very happy people. No matter how much stuff they get out there, they're still pretty messed up. Why? Because they haven't started to travel the spiritual path in any real ways. Maybe a little bit when they're here, but not in a real way, which we'll talk about momentarily. So most of them are Atlantean consciousness, still connected, ironically, to the Atlantean race, which has been around for thousands of years here. So Next, we're going to find out is that the basic training, if we look at the 8 limbs of yoga and what we're going to learn about in the Yoga Sutras, is they may take on some of the yamas and niyamas, the do's and don'ts of moral life to help calm their emotions. They may do some of that, but honestly, a lot of them will throw that out the window, those moral do's and don'ts, if they start to get a lot of power and pleasure, money, and sex for themselves. And if they don't really believe in a heaven anymore where they're going to go and die and get lots of money, sex, pleasure, and power, they may throw all that out when they get to the level of the coordinated personality. Or even if they say they believe in it, they really don't, or they just say they believe in it to manipulate the masses who do believe in it so they can get more money, sex, pleasure, and power. That's the basics that we see in the Bailey book with the coordinated personality. Then we move into the integrated personality where we're starting to tread the spiritual path. Here we see that line personality in her traditional model goes all the way up and includes the plane of the lower mind, called it the lower mental plane here. This is where she has the beginning of her initiations. Each initiation is an expansion of consciousness. This is where the first and second initiations happen. The first 2 expansions of consciousness, which is based on the idea of esoteric Christianity. They're called the birth into spiritual life, the baptism, the purification of our mind and emotions. We're starting to tread the spiritual path. We're starting to take up the Yoga Sutras, the asanas, pranayama, the yamas and niyamas in a more serious, heartfelt way. And we're starting to add the pratyahara and the dharana, the interiorization of the mind, the beginning steps of concentrating the mind, so that we can understand our minds, how our minds are conditioned. Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we think what we think? How do we think? Can we control our thinking? Can we concentrate and focus our thinking? All of this is part of the process of the integrated personality on the lower mental plane, or it should have been really called the plane of the lower mind. And this is where we start to develop more Aryan consciousness. The problem with this level is we're more mental, but we can also be more emotionally cold. It's kind of like Spock in the Star Trek series, though he was really moving into some soul-infused values here. He maintained his human side. We should say he maintained his soul. This difficulty in here is as we gain a lot of mind, and Patanjali will talk about this, especially as we get to book 3, the temptations of this mastery of the mind result in city powers. Those city powers and our increased understanding of how to manipulate not only our mind, but the minds of others, especially through meme magic, which we're seeing going on in the internet a lot, people creating memes to try and make the masses down here be manipulated against their own better interest, so they can basically make slaves out of them to serve themselves. These kinds of city powers must be overcome at the end of the baptism, what Bailey calls her second initiation. That is when, in esoteric Christianity, Jesus goes out into the desert and is tempted. What are the temptations? They're basically about money, sex, pleasure, and power. Are you going to use your new spiritual powers, your new mental powers, we really should call them, to serve the greater good or to serve yourself? What are you going to do with that? And as we go through the birth and the baptism, the first and the second initiations, we're in some real trouble. And Bailey's book, Esoteric Psychology, Volume 2, talks about a lot of the spiritual problems that can happen in that first and second initiation. A lot of her discipleship in the New Age books talk about that too, because her disciples were primarily going through the first and second initiations as well here. So most of her material is about this, and most of her meditations, if you look at them, and I do have the collection of those meditations in the patreon.com Soul to Spirit website. Those are available. If you become a free member, you can get those for free. Those meditations are primarily pratyahara and dharana, maybe a little bit of dhyana in there. And that's something for you to be aware of, because we don't really see the higher training in her book. It's hinted at in Rays and Initiations, but we don't really see it in her books because she's focused mainly here. And that's what she says with her Raja Yoga, that we're working towards the third initiation, which is where we go up in here into the higher mental or the plane of the solar angel where the soul is, soul consciousness is. And this is also called the causal body of egoic lotus, the body of the soul. And this is where we start to infuse the well-trained mind with spiritual values here. And those values are compassion, understanding, wisdom, harmlessness, inclusiveness, etc., etc. So those soul values are heart values. We're cultivating the heart mind here, and that is what is going on. And over here, we're going to start to practice more and more of dhyana and the initial samadhis with the experiencer. This is an important point. This is not emphasized in the Bailey books. This is if you get into the yoga training itself, and when you really understand the Yoga Sutras, you are starting at the end of the Yoga Sutras to take the fourth initiation and getting ready to go into the fifth initiation, where you will move up into what Bailey calls her triad of Atma, Buddhi, Manas, this higher point of the plane of the solar angels here. You'll start to go into the triad, where you'll reach the Atmic and the Buddhic plane, which is also the plane of Christ, Krishna, Buddhic consciousness here. You'll start to become more like a Buddha or a Christ or like Krishna. And that is where you have a tremendous amount of wisdom and love, and it's planetary really in scope, and then eventually the Atmic plane. When you get up into those levels, we have the samadhis without experiencer. This is where the fourth initiation slowly destroys the soul or causal body. Why? Because the soul is the karta. It's the sense of I. It's a spiritualized I at this level, because the soul has gone through the process of coordinating the personality, integrating the personality, and getting that personality to be soul infused. But it's an individual spark of God, so to speak. So when we sit down and meditate, we have that sense of, I am meditating, I am concentrating, I am watching my thoughts, I am in the initial samadhis. That ends in the higher samadhis. There is no sense of individual I. Now, eventually you have to learn how to have the universal sense of self and the individual I, or you can't function down here to help humanity. So that is the final samadhi known as Dharma Mega Samadhi, where you can be in the world and not of it, to borrow a Christian phrase from Jesus here. So that's the overview of the model again. Now, another quick point. A lot of Bailey students are not aware of this. These are found in Bailey's book, From Intellect to Intuition. And it was really amazing when I put this together, because most Bailey students are aware of these three. Well, maybe they're not even aware of these two. But basically, on the emotional plane, humans can think. They have a lower mind, per se, going back to our previous quote. And that mind is developed into three different levels. Bailey has instinctual mind, which is kind of in here, the lower concrete mind, which is in here, and personality mind, which is in here. It's a surprise to see this word lower concrete mind repeated twice, because then what you have to do is go through the Bailey books and realize when it says lower concrete mind, which lower concrete mind, which lower mind are we talking about? This one that's in here, or this one that's in here? And for example, in the quote we just read, we're really talking more about desire mind, the lower concrete mind. Here we're talking about a mind that is more controlled, but there's still hints of that desire in there. Otherwise, we would have passed the second initiation. We would have been purified, baptized. We would no longer be tempted by money, sex, pleasure, and power in terms of our ability to serve others and not just ourselves here. But it's important to be aware of this. Personality mind is up here. It's those coordinated personalities that have powerful minds, but they use it primarily to achieve all their own ends, and they can be very dictatorial, narcissistic, and selfish. Up here, lower concrete mind is here. The sun of mind is here. It refers to the soul. And the abstract mind is this little point right at the very top here. Now, there are people that talk about contacting the abstract mind. That's really difficult to do. We have abstract mind down here. You know, most teenagers have an abstract mind where they can imagine what it'd be like to live on Mars. That abstract mind is really different than what Bailey talks about in terms of here. Because she also says in a treatise on white magic that when we reach this level, we are creating the formulas for how things work. It's not just looking at some colors or lines and using the abstract mind. It helps to try and figure out what might that mean. It's you know what that means, and you're creating the formulas that help us understand E equals MC squared, how life works. You're not guessing and trying to intuit in an abstract way. You know how it works, and you're figuring it out. Some people misinterpret that as meaning you brought it down to the concrete mind. The formula E equals MC squared is still highly abstract to almost everybody. Even if you know the basics of what it means, you don't know how to work that formula out. To be able to do that means you are up here. So these are some very important points to consider here. So that overview took a lot longer than I thought. I usually end up doing that. The problem above is that once again, Bailey is failing to understand that vrittis do not just involve the lower psychic nature or lower mind and astral and emotional reactions. The vrittis aren't just about getting out of the emotional plane with the astral and emotional reactions and the lower mind that functions there and the lower psychic nature that functions there. The problem is about being able to get higher than that, and even higher than the lower mind, and even higher than the plane of the solar angel where the soul resides, all the way up into the triad. So to finish it off, she says, therefore, the reaction called pain must be transcended. She's referring back to this. And likewise, that term pleasure or non-painful, for both of these are dependent upon identification with the form. Non-attachment must supersede them. Whether pain or pleasure comes in our life, we know that they will always cycle back and forth, and we are not attached. We can appreciate and enjoy, but we're not attached. We can experience pain. We will experience physical pain, but we can learn how to manage it in such a way it does not cause suffering, where we become attached to that pain or that painful trauma, and it keeps looping in our minds, etc., etc. It is interesting to note that the modifications of the internal organ, the mind, are 5 in number. Manas or mind, the actuating principle of the chitta or mind stuff, is the 5th principle, and like all else in nature, manifest as a duality. And I'm going to put up the mental plane part of her chart again, because here we have the duality. Number 5, this is the 5th plane, so that's where we have the number 5. It's the plane of the solar angel is the 1. The 2 is the plane of the lower mind. That's what she means as it manifests as a duality. All right. Thank you so much for listening. We're at the end of this particular sutra. If you are watching this on Patreon, please comment and share. I do respond to all comments. I'm happy to have a discussion there. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can also comment there. I do my best to get back to those comments. I don't follow it as much as on the Patreon channel, and I invite you to become a Patreon. There's a lot of perks if you go over to Patreon. Please check us out at patreon.com/Soul2Spirit.